I myself call capacities. Capacities to affect and be affected. It is the same thing, whether you use Deleuzean terminology or whether you use my terminology. As you can see from the last two classes, I go for clarity. To me, a basic principle is, if something is worthwhile saying, it is worthwhile saying clearly. If something really captures your imagination, if you really think this is important philosophically, why obscuring it behind a bunch of jargon? Deleuze doesn't obviously agree with me. And for instance, capacities to affect and be affected. I would just leave it like that. It says exactly what it is. A knife has the capacity to cut, but it's a capacity that can only be exercised. In other words, it has the capacity to affect things by cutting, but it's a capacity that can only be exercised if that thing has the capacity to be affected. It's cuttable. So something that it has the capacity to cut need to be coupled to something that has the capacity to be cut, like a melon or a banana, not a block of titanium. That not only a Ginzu knife would be able to cut. Deleuze thinks that shortening that entire sentence, capacities to affect and be affected, gives you a little bit more speed. And because he's a philosopher of speed, he's a philosopher of accelerating thought, you shave a couple of seconds, from capacities to affect and be affected to affects. You're shaving a couple of seconds there. But because most people don't understand that word, you're actually wasting hours later on, right? Most people I know, even Deleuzians, think that the word affect refers to something emotional, to affectivity, to affects like the emotion of joy or the emotion of sadness. Now that is one way in which humans can be affected. We can be affected emotionally. We can be moved by a poem. We can be moved by a piece of music. We can be moved by a sunset or by a fantastic natural view like the one we have outside. And that way, nature affects us emotionally, moves us emotionally. But the knife has an affect, capacity to cut, that has nothing to do with its feelings, You almost never go to the knife, I'm going to use it to cut something, I hope you feel good about it. I know you are against cutting things, but you're a knife, man. Let's face it. Very few people talk to kitchen utensils that way. Which means that the word affect really refers to something much vaster than emotional affects. And yet he chose it to summarize the sentence or the phrase capacities to affect and be affected. The same thing with tendencies. I think it's a much clearer thing to say water in the liquid state has a tendency to become ice when it reaches that critical point of 0 degrees centigrade, and has a tendency to boil, has a tendency to become steam when it reaches that critical point of 100 degrees centigrade. Because those critical points are also called singularities, Deleuze uses the word singularity. But nobody understands what he's talking about when he uses that word. When he says, let's replace laws, the exact sentence goes like this. He's attacking something that he calls the hylomorphic schema, which also goes back to Aristotle. And it is a theory of the genesis of form. Both in my philosophy and the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, the genesis of form of plants and animals, the genesis of the form of clouds, the genesis of the form of mountains. In other words, morphogenesis. Morphogenesis is a key concept because it is something very important. It's what gives order, what gives form to the world, not to mention that for artists who are morphogenetic entities, you guys are producing form, you guys are giving birth to new forms, you are also agents of morphogenesis. So that word should be very important to you too. There are two basically different theories of morphogenesis. When you believe in essences, you believe that matter is basically an inert receptacle for forms that come from the outside. Whether it is a Platonic essence of sphericity that comes and makes matter spherical, gives matter the form of a sphere, or some other essence that gives matter form, Matter itself is inert. It's just an inert receptacle that couldn't do anything by itself. That is also the theory of morphogenesis that's in the Bible. In the Bible, matter is just this inert receptacle that needs God to come with concepts and words and then command it into form. Let there be light. I want there to be light. I command you to shine. And then let there be animals and plants. All those commands that supposedly on the 7 days of creation gave form to the world, form that began as words in the mind of God. In other words, as the Bible says, and the verb became flesh. The verb, words come first in the mind of God, and as concepts, as categories, and then they become flesh. Then they give form to a matter that's basically inert. So Platonism, biblical religion, and other sources of the hylomorphic schema of this idea that morphogenesis is a form that exists conceptually first, and then informs a matter that's inert, is something that Deleuze fights against. And in that particular quote, is we need to combat the hylomorphic schema. The hylomorphic schema presupposes a matter that is inert and obedient, a matter that follows commands, a matter that if a God tells it, let there be light, begins shining, but if they had not tell it, let there be light, it would be, just an inert stuff that's just sitting there. And we need to replace it with a matter that has morphogenetic capacities and tendencies of its own. A matter that on its own, on reaching a certain level of temperature, begins emitting radiation. It's like a metal that is now red hot and begins shining. Matter can shine by itself. Matter can produce light by itself. Matter can adopt forms by itself. Think, for instance, of something as simple as soap bubbles. Everybody has played with soap bubbles. You put some, you capture a film of soap, of soapy molecules. It's a whole population of molecules. You capture it on a wire, and then you blow inside it, creating pressure differences between the inside and the outside. Any intensive differences, as we saw it yesterday, drive a process, in this case the process of bubble formation. The spheres form entirely by themselves as the population of soapy molecules or fatty acid molecules in the film organizes itself into a sphere. Now that's not an easy thing to do. When an artist tries to produce a sphere, when you go to a wood shop or a carpenter's, a place and try to create a sphere out of wood or try to create a sphere out of metal, it takes you hours to create a sphere. But here we have a very humble material that exists in bathrooms and kitchens, soap, that by itself produces bubbles at a certain singularity. As the bubble tries to minimize the differences on pressure between its inside and its outside. So, a matter that's endowed with tendencies and capacities is an active matter. It has its own tendencies and it has its own capacity. And it's by realizing those tendencies and by exercising those capacities that it generates form. The other matter is an inert matter that is an obedient stuff that follows laws. So even though it's really just an image that's changing from one to the other because we're keeping the referent intact, this things too, and I'm going to now draw my famous arrows. This are also capturing the immanent powers of becoming. You're basically also saying, with singularities and affects, we can explain that objective content of science. We don't have to say that science is masculinist or